Gracias a todo el mundo por estar aquí. Es una exposición esta de Jeff Wall para Virreina, para la ciudad, una exposición importante, muy significativa. Es muy difícil hacer una exposición de Jeff Wall. No por nada, es difícil porque es difícil reunir tantas obras que tienen cada una historia, una procedencia, una manera de montarse, una manera de presentarse. Creo que la exposición, ya lo he dicho esta mañana en la rueda de prensa, pero lo repito, no es solo una gran exposición de Jeff Wall, sino es una gran exposición comisariada por quizás una de las personas que mejor conoce el trabajo de Jeff Wall y que más, cuya voz ha sido quizás más importante para construir los principales relatos alrededor de la obra de Jeff Wall y también alrededor de otras cuestiones que tienen que ver con la fotografía, que es Jean-François Chevrier. Quiero, ayudado por Elia Pijolet también. Me parece que se unen dos sensibilidades, ¿no? La sensibilidad de Jeff Wall, la sensibilidad de Jean-François Chevrier, y estamos, yo diría, ante una exposición diferente del trabajo de Jeff y una exposición sin duda para nosotros, para Virreina, una exposición que es un punto y seguido respecto a cosas que hemos estado trabajando durante todos estos años. Espero que disfrutéis mucho la exposición. Después de la charla vamos a estar 45 minutos, hacemos un cuarto de hora de preguntas y así. Vamos a intentar ser puntuales porque creo que va a haber un poco de lío así general de mucha gente y me gustaría que disfrutarais la exposición. Y me gustaría que pudieseis sentados, mirar las fotografías, fabular con cada una de ellas y percibir todas esas asociaciones tan sutiles, tan precisas que Jean-François ha preparado para todos vosotros. Muchas gracias y gracias a Jeff y gracias a Jean-François por estar aquí.
So good evening, even if it's not a real evening in Spain, 6 o'clock. I think we should start saying how much we enjoyed working in that place, and enjoyed the place. I mean the people, of course, working in that place, but also the place in itself. I mean these 15 rooms are really a very nice tour to present the work of Jeff. There are two parts. First part with 9 rooms, and second one with 6. And most of these rooms are small. I mean, in proportion with Jeff's works. For sure, some very big works could not enter the space, but you will maybe see that some very big works entered the space. It's even surprising, but it's thanks to somebody in the room. So sometimes you have a small room and a big picture, but a big picture in a small room, it's very nice. It's something which is not usual, but it's and then it gives you a feeling of the work, which is, I think, fundamental for Jeff, which is a feeling of intimacy. Excuse me, my voice is a little bit broken. There's nothing to do against it. So just I speak or I don't speak. But I'm supposed to speak, so. What I was saying. Yes, this feeling of intimacy. I think this is something you insisted a lot on when you said, for example, that you discovered painting with the abstract expressionists, the American abstract expressionists. They were making big paintings, but for you it was the intimacy of the experience which was important. And it is also something these painters themselves wanted to produce. I mean, it's not just your experience. Anyway, this I think you will get in the show this feeling of intimacy. So it's the first point, which is, I think, important to notice. And second, because there are 15 rooms, it makes a lot of divisions. So each time entering a new room, you can have a new experience in a way. So you can have a continuity, of course, and I hope you will feel this continuity, but it's a continuity made of displacements, of transformations. And I think this fits also with the way the work of Jeff evolved these last years. And third, I think the show is really about diversity, and I think it's what is so enjoyable now in the work of Jeff, is this feeling of diversity, of many directions. Even sometimes against the idea of a style. Maybe sometimes you think, but you know, how many artists are there in there? Because you know the works are different. And for me, since a long time, this diversity is a real quality in itself, a pleasure, because you have this pleasure of changing your mind each time, which is, you know, each picture is an experience. Each picture is specific in terms of experience. So for the visitor, it's a way of changing his or her mind. And this diversity is not eclecticism. I think it's very important to say it. It's not running, you know, in any direction. You know, I was saying this morning, it's not the chien fou, you know, who goes everywhere. So it's diverse, but it's following some trends which are sometimes a little bit subterranean. And I think you will get this in the show, this idea of things which are going underground. And I stop here, but this idea of the ground is also very important in the show. You will see, especially at the end. At the end, you really get this idea. But you have it since the very beginning. Since the very first room, the two first rooms, you have this idea of the ground. So you have the ground, and we are living on the ground, so it's about life. But there is also the underground, and the space of, which is a space of invisibility. So this is very present, I think, in the show. Anyway, all this, all what I said, is possible because of the space. It is this space which gives the opportunity of working on these topics I just mentioned.
Thank you. I also want to say that I'm very happy to make an exhibition here, partly because of the look of it, as Jean-François said, but also because I think the Center for the Image is doing such an interesting program over the last few years that I've known about it. It seems like it's really one of the most sophisticated projects anywhere I've seen for a long time. So I'm really very, very happy to be part of it and can somehow contribute to it. And we've had a really wonderful time here with all the people from Valentine, all of them, everybody who's made the exhibition. It's been really one of the nicest experiences we've had. So I'm very, very happy about that. Also because I got to come back to Barcelona for, I don't know how many times I've been here now, but I've been coming to the city for 50 years on and off. And so to come and have an exhibition now is really very, very satisfying to me. Let me just maybe make a couple of comments following on from Jean-François. As I said, I did say this morning, if any of you were at the press conference, that I've always tried to make my pictures very singular, that is one at a time, and not part of any sort of ensemble or series. And there's different reasons for that, but maybe the most important one is I want them always to be unique entities. Each one the result of a specific experience I had, a specific circumstance I was in. I don't think that they're autobiographical in any sense, except that they really do, they all have come out of experiences or moments that I've really lived through in one way or the other. And it seemed to me important to isolate them so that the pictorial unity of the work, which is something I've always pursued, could be experienced most intensely. I sometimes thought of them, my pictures, as big cats that don't like to have any other big cats anywhere near them because they are a bit territorial. And so they have this sort of solitude, maybe like crocodiles or something. And that was a thought I've had forever. But the more exhibitions I've made, especially the last 10 years or so, when I've had a chance to make some pretty big ones, I was surprised to realize that sort of behind my back, these unique or singular entities ended up having similarities or resemblances or echoes between them, and began to kind of relate to each other as if they were discovering that they were all part of a big clan of some sort. And so I've been trying to make exhibitions that acknowledge that and play with it even, or at least emphasize it. And so it's been kind of satisfying to me over the last while to see that, things I didn't realize I was interested in particularly came back. And as I've noticed that, I guess I have learned that I must be somebody, a certain person, because I've never really thought of myself as anybody. Just I'm aware of being alive, but I'm not sure I was anybody, whether I had any personality or character or anything, or as Jean-François said, had a style. But it seems like that's probably true, but I can't explain why, and it was sort of unintentional. But maybe the similarities that exist are interesting. I hope they'll be interesting to you. They're interesting to me because of the fact that they were really done they really were achieved unintentionally. And I think I can really be sure in saying that they were thoroughly unintentional. So that probably gives them some sort of validity. Jean-François also mentioned the size of my pictures. And I think you'll see in the exhibition, of course, there are many different sizes. I sort of got well known for making big pictures, sometimes very big ones. And the reasons for that have to do with the interrelation, in my own experience at least, between the arts, the different arts, photography, cinema, and painting most prominently, but I think literature is also very much part of that. Painting, and I painted as a child, and as a young person for quite a while. Painting, it really taught the world how to see. Painting really, in the last 1,000 years, has really taught us an enormous amount about how to see ourselves. And many other things, of course, how to see nature, how to see light, how to see color, and so on. And it did it through a certain kind of technical freedom that painters had always had, to design or invent their pictures according to a very open criterion. Technically, paintings can be any size, tiny, big. It's inherent in the medium. But what it did do is found a certain kind of scale, which we can't really define, but it allows people to see an image in a comfortable, physical, and emphatic way. And I always wanted that for the pictures I made when I was painting, but when I began to do photography, I didn't want to lose that. And photography, in the period when I was beginning to encounter it, was still dominated by the reportage notion of the photograph as being part of a publication. And so it had its limited scale. And that was an orthodoxy that was perfectly legitimate, but didn't really strike me as allowing for what was really possible in the actual medium of photography. And it seemed that what painting had taught me, it seemed that with what I had learned from painting, I should be able to apply it to my photography without becoming a painter, and without imitating painting, but to access the energy of that scale and freedom of size and freedom of address that a millennium of painting has taught us. And I've been accused of imitating painting as photography, therefore it's not really photography and all that stuff. But I don't think that's true, because I don't think one needs to paint to create the tableau. There's a family relationship between these art forms that exists because there is this terrain, you could call it, this space, which is, we can call the tableau space, if you want to think of it that way, that creates a suspension in which the relationships between the arts can be reinvented. And I felt that the form of the tableau created this suspended space. By what I mean is that definitions of painting, definitions of photography, definitions like that are suspended and begin to float and become relatable.
In the early 80s, you were speaking of specific opposite to painting, photography as a specific opposite to painting, and I think it was a very good formula. Would you use it now?
I still was thinking in the kind of classical dialectical way in the 80s. And I don't know whether I think of it. I don't know whether I think that way now. But I wouldn't deny it, because all I meant was that one comes into a relationship with an art form not to imitate it, but to learn from it and go elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So I also will say that the classic photography, that is Cartier-Bresson, Walker-Evans, they also were related to painting. They also related to cinema, and they also related to literature, no different than me. They tended to deny it, and there was a discourse in photography that emphatically denied it in the 20s and 30s and so on. But I would take a Freudian take on that denial. I would say it's a symptomatic denial that those photographers needed to deny that relationship in order to do what they have to do. Therefore, that was a relationship. I didn't feel a need to deny that for the reasons I've been talking about. So anyway, the idea of intimacy that Jean-François mentioned earlier has to do with the size of a picture. And pictures, as they become easier to relate to physically in this emphatic format, weirdly or strangely or unexpectedly, I think they become not more intimate, but they become intimate in a fresh and interesting way. For example, at natural size, which I work at a lot, you can have a strange experience in front of an image painted or photographed where you can observe something that looks very much like the world around you when you're not looking at pictures, but of course it's arrested and frozen, and you can look at it from a distance and see it as a whole, and then you can come close to it and see it from close up, and it creates a certain strange sense that you are in a world not your own and observing it from very close up in a sort of magical way, and that creates a very interestingly dynamic way of experiencing an image. So we tried to design the rooms or design the ensembles in the rooms to kind of do two things. One, allow that kind of tableau to do its work, do its magic, but also to show you that there's no primary format or primary size for me. I like to think I can do anything in a very free kind of way.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be a terrible weakness for a photographer not to be able to make nice little pictures.
Nice little pictures.
I think it's absolutely necessary for a photographer to have the experience of the little picture and not play the game systematically of the big format. I think it was an awful distortion in the recent field of photography. And I am a little bit responsible of it because I articulated this idea of tableau, which was so badly interpreted. You did it very well, but unfortunately, a lot of people consider that it was just a matter of enlargement. And I must say once more, I said it already many times, that I'm absolutely against this idea that the tableau is about enlargement. And in this show, the very first tableau is a very small picture. It's called diagonal composition. It's like this, and in fact, it's natural size. It's a natural size of what you see, but it is small. It's not a big tableau. And then you have beside an average tableau, and the big one, the first big one, is only in the second room, in a connection which is very similar to the first one, into the first room. And then, if we mention this idea of the format, we have also to, I think, to mention the idea of composition. I think that I like this title, diagonal composition, because in the early 90s, it was really a gesture, something to say, to talk about composition. I mean, you have to remember that in the 70s, nobody would have mentioned the idea of composition. The key word at the time was more construction, you know. It was a moment of abstraction and so on. And composition was a little bit old-fashioned. It was a term of the academy, of the Beaux-Arts period and so on. But I think that Jeff, it's why also we had this discussion, the internal academy was very interested in this vocabulary, this, let's say, pre-modern, I don't know if it's the good term, vocabulary. And in this show, it was important for us to stress on this idea of composition and do it with a work at the beginning of the show called diagonal composition. And if you look a little bit, you will see in the show, if maybe you saw already, the very last picture is quite big, but not very big. It's called Flooded Grave. It's a very typical Jeff Wall work, and it's quite well known as a typical work of Jeff, and it is a diagonal composition. You see, I mean, the structure is absolutely with the very first diagonal composition. So what does it mean, this? What does it mean, this idea of composition? What is the relationship with construction, which is also in the show, because Odradek is a construction. There is at least one clear construction. So what is the difference between composition and construction? I think it's interesting to be a little bit precise here in terms of concepts of words, because I mean, at the end we think with words, so we have to. So I would say that composition is made of parts. It's different parts of composition. A construction is made of elements. It's a very simple difference. I don't mean that one is better than the other, but I think that they are different. So, and I think the work of Jeff is very much about composition and very much about the idea of the picture as the result of a composition, but he integrated the language of construction, which is, for example, the language of abstraction, for example. And diagonal composition is obviously related to the story of abstract painting, because it is the diagonal composition is, you know, it's about the debate between Mondrian and Van Doesburg. So what about this idea of composition for you?
I think I've, been accused or criticized over the years as turning my back on some of the most important achievements of the radical period of modern art, which claimed and wanted to break with certain limitations of past art to develop a new art, which is something that, of course, really did happen. But when I began to encounter the consequences of the art of the 40s, 50s, 60s, which I did encounter as a young person in the 60s and into the 70s, I began to feel that some of the fundamental values that had been established in the let's call it the avant-garde period were tired, that they had become conventional by that time, and that they didn't convince me of their necessity any further, or at least the conditions had changed. And so when I began to try to practice photography and in a way force my way into photography to find my own way, I had to instinctively contradict some of those things. And one of the reasons, or one of the things that gave me the confidence to do that was my real affection for the art of all times, of modern, of current, but of ancient, and finding that in fact there were certain commonalities that passed through hundreds and even thousands of years. And if we look back on the 80s, 70s, 80s, we can see that there was a debate about the anti-aesthetic and the aesthetic. And in some ways, the 80s showed us that there was a kind of, and this is a long story, but there was a kind of reaction against the idea of the superiority of the anti-aesthetic. And it allowed to come back into the discussion issues that, as Jean-François said, were more or less sidelined by a kind of orthodoxy that emerged out of the period between, let's say, 1920 and 1970. And that somehow resonated with me, partly because of my childhood, which was spent looking at reproductions mostly of artworks of all times, all the way up to now. And really not, maybe as a young person, not really being able to see a real meaningful difference, at least not being able to feel a meaningful difference between something made in the 14th century and something made 14 days ago. And that was my experience, that was my personal experience. Now, in the subsequent period, you know, people have talked a lot about the recovery of the aesthetic and the idea of beauty and all this discussion, the idea of this aesthetic turn in not only in art but in the discussion about art. And it's still very controversial, of course, and it's not a settled matter. But I think I've been in my own way part of it, not in a public sense, but part of it because I feel like picture making hasn't changed very much over the last 1,000 years and doesn't need to. And so I feel like the terms that had been critiqued in that time lived in an interesting shadow world in the 70s and 80s. Critique terms didn't vanish, you know? When a term like composition or beauty was critiqued relentlessly and even effectively, it didn't become obsolete and it didn't vanish. It lived in a different space, the space of its denial, shall we say. And I think that my pictures began to emerge out of that shadow, the shadows of, in a way, the shadows of the orthodoxy that emerged out of the avant-garde period. And I you know, I found that one was afraid to live in that shadow world because it wasn't orthodox. But after a while, I got used to it, And I realized that that space was a very alive, it was a very alive space. Just the way that looking at, say, Piero della Francesca is still a live experience for me, and I'm sure it is for a lot of other people. What is that live experience? Well, to be short, composition is one of the fundamental frames of reference of that long artistic history. And the fact that it was critiqued so effectively and with such intelligence by a few generations of people who had their reasons made it more interesting. And in fact, I would say that the real fervent opposition to these qualities, paradoxically, gave them new life and opened another period in their presence in the actual practice of artists. And I feel like that was a wave I surfed for like several decades already. I'm still surfing it a bit old to surf, but still surfing it slightly. So, and that, of course, that term composition then brings in all the other ones, which we don't have to enumerate. But the idea that there's a commonality between the newest art and the oldest is something that is not really an original thought of mine, obviously.
At the beginning in the entrance of the second part of the show, there is a quotation of you, which could have been perfectly presented at the very beginning of the entire show. Maybe I read it even if you know it already. I mean, even if some of you know it already. There has been a dramatic mediation of the conceptual element in art. Without this mediation, you have only concepts on one hand and pictures on the other. Images become a decorative completion of an already fully evolved thought. They are just illustrations, so they are boring. There is no drama. But what makes dramatization possible? I think it is a program or a project that was once called La peinture de la vie moderne. I think it's just perfect. It's a perfect introduction to the work of Jeff, but we put it at the beginning of the second section. I'll let you imagine why. In this quotation, there is an interesting point. Jeff says, a program, La peinture de la vie moderne. It is your program because the expression doesn't exist in Baudelaire. It's le peintre de la vie moderne and not la peinture de la vie moderne. So you invented la peinture de la vie moderne from Baudelaire. And second, there is another thing which is, I think, very important in this quotation, is the idea of drama and dramatization. I remember in the 80s, it is what appealed to me very much in your work. It was not about making pictures, in this very literal, very descriptive way, which was, coming from pop, and it was a kind of neo-pop or post-pop and so on way. It was really, there was a dramatization in the proper sense of the word, which is theater, which is an organization of figures and so on. And we should just remember that this idea of dramatization was, in the long time ago, I mean in the 15th century, very closely related with composition. Composition and drama were absolutely combined, especially in Italy, when the tradition of the pictorial Jeff is working on was in a way invented. This
Can you hear me? Yes?
Text is
I'll leave it here.
coming from a dialogue we had in 1990 called The Inner Academy and we are back to what we were talking about just previously.
Let me talk about the 2 points you made. One is the peinture de la vie moderne. I sort of got stuck myself with that 30, 40 years ago by even mentioning it. And people have always thought that I thought of myself as this character, this painter of modern life. I want to clarify the fact that this painting of modern life was beautifully articulated by Baudelaire one time in one text. And sometimes there's a person who can say things that no one else can say in a way that makes you understand them in a way that no one else could make you understand them. And that's him. And what he did for me was to show me that there's a way in which these long-lived values, aesthetic values that I was mentioning earlier, have a way of contacting the immediacy of the right now. That's all it was. To find that what he described was a way in which things that had attitudes, techniques, approaches, and attitudes and approaches and techniques that go back a long way and have been practiced by hundreds of good artists, and have proven themselves to be useful or at least essential, aren't old. They never age. And the proof of that is they come into contact with the immediate experience of someone, an artist in this case, and they fuse into a quality, a pictorial quality that both seems antique or permanent, and as he said, the fusion of the permanent and the fleeting. And that seemed to me an encyclopedic plan of activity. And also, of course, defined photography as this capture of the fleeting, the essentially fleeting, because that's what we do. So it seemed to me as just a path to follow, or a map, and not an identity. But you know, when things get into the media, they get reworked, and so I sort of got. It would seem that I was making a claim for myself as that person. There is no such person. Any artist can be that person, and I'm that person when I succeed in being that person. And the other question, what was it?
Dramatization.
Yeah, sorry. I think that every visual artist, sculptor, painter, photographer, is a writer, because we have to have subjects. We have to have a starting point of something to show, and in order to do that, we have to engage with the flow of life and the emergence of circumstances. So you know, if I make every picture I've made, as I said, emerges from an actual moment of experience, whatever it might be, and I have claimed the freedom that artists in every other field have to find that starting point anywhere. Why should a photographer not have the same freedom as a poet or a musical composer to start from a random observation, a thought, an idle dream, a story someone told them, a memory, all these things that everybody else can use? Why photography should not have that freedom? And I wanted that, and I took it for myself. So I think, but what that also showed me is that everybody who makes visual art is writing. They are writing the scenarios that they need to start with. But the writing isn't written. It's a writing that isn't written. It's an unwritten writing. Sometimes it's even an erasure. Sometimes I've said that bringing together figures in a space should not involve narration. In a way, must not involve narration. So, but because bringing two entities together in a single space will be a narration by nature, we can't avoid it. We have to, therefore, come into this conflicted relation with narration. And the simplest way I can express it is that we erase. We don't write. Our writing is the erasure of the narration. And in the process of erasing the narration, we free ourselves from the consequences of any flow of time because we're composing a static pattern. Picture is a static pattern. And in order to achieve the static pattern in its real purity and its total emphasis, this has to be suppressed. Narration needs to be suppressed somehow. And again, it is a dialectical thought. Suppression of narration is our way of accepting it, but we have to erase it to do that. So we're writers in this way. And therefore, we're dramatists in that way. And so I do reject the idea of theater in relation to my pictures, and I'll maybe say a word about that. But I do accept the idea that the erasure is the erasure of a dramatic description of some kind. That might sound perverse, but in fact it's really my experience of how I work. When I'm working on any of these pictures, I've tried to make sure I never narrate to myself, and I censor myself as much as possible in order to do that, because we have to make the image on that space, and it's never moves. It's entirely static. And the only way we can get the life into that is through this process, in my opinion. I use the term cinematography for my work generally because I feel that that in the cinema, in the photographic aspect of the cinema, there's been a lot of interesting and very creative invention of how to practice photography, and it involves the kind of things that I have to do. I prefer cinematography to theatricality, and I really dislike the term staged photography, because staged photography suggests a stage.
But dramatization and staging are not the same. Huh?
True enough.
You can use dramatization without meaning staging.
Yes, and I'm agreeing with you on that. I accept the idea that dramatization is the mode of erased narration. Fine, but theater is not the right framework, because theater is an institution that has such pronounced conventions that they're restricting. Cinematography suggests a much more fluid relation between the elements, so that theater suggests actors, rehearsals, etc., and all this stuff, which I would only use if I need to. Cinematography can suggest the smallest inflection of the actual, so that I could make a picture that I have collaborated with someone on by doing the smallest inflection of an actual situation, or I can create an alternative world very laboriously and physically and photograph that, and anywhere in between. It's a much more flexible concept. So I don't think that the theater term is relevant to the way I practice it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for coming and for this show. I wanted to ask you if you feel any close to the work of people like Philip Lorca di Corsia, Gregory Crutzen, in any way, or theoretically, or in your practice. Thank you very much.
I mean, those are people whose work has been around for a long time, and I've seen their work for a long time, and along with a lot of other photographers. I'm interested in anyone's work, not necessarily all the time. So I feel like I keep up to date and look closely at other people's work as much as I can, which is pretty consistently. So yes, I mean, I'm interested in what those people do along with others. I feel like I've been part of something that they were also part of. The photography of the 80s, shall we call it that, which I consider to be one of the... I think there were 2 or 3 really turning point moments in the technical history, at least, if not the artistic history of photography. And obviously one emerged around the 20s when small cameras were made available and reportage really took off. It became this kind of sine qua non of what photography should be. In the 70s, maybe more than the 80s, the things we've been talking about, the emergence of the cross-referencing of photography with other things and the breaking of its isolation that emerged from that orthodoxy of the 20s happened. That was a real turning point. I think that it probably maybe will be seen as important as the one from the 20s. And I was part of that. But we must realize that the photo revolution of the 80s is 40 years old now, almost 50. It's happened. It's almost history. I'm almost history here. That wasn't accomplished by any one or two people. It was actually carried out by a lot of people, including, and I'm not referring to Gregory or Philip in this sense, including people who made bad work, by the way. I'm not saying they made bad work. I'm saying that this expansion of photography came in some ways at a cost. That is, in the Orthodox period, when photography was more carefully defined, the quality in general was higher because the field was more restricted and it was harder to do really bad work. But when things got more free, it was possible for quality standards to fall substantially. And there's been a lot of really terrible work done in this mode in the last 4 decades. And I'm not naming names here. I just mean that process is complicated. It involved a lot of setbacks and negative elements as well, which we don't have to get into right now. And a lot of people were involved in it. And I have studied and thought about most of those people at one time or another. Time for a drink.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, La Virreina, for making this possible. It's so good to see Jeff Wall exhibition in Spain. I'm going to ask you a probably boring question for you because you've probably been asked many times, but obviously like this idea of Lightbox is so entangled with your name. Wherever you see a Lightbox, the first thing or the first artist we think it's you. But also like with the rise of like smartphone, obviously this is before that, but I want to think about like the role of advertisement, also the connection with art history. What is the role of like what made you start with this idea of Lightbox in your practice?
Interesting question because yeah, I have been asked it many times. But one of the most important things about it was that in the 70s and the 60s, one of the real reigning ideas young artists had, and this sort of was related to minimal art actually, which emerged in the mid-60s, and then some of the consequences, was that interesting art of its time should have the look of non-art. That's what everybody thought. Art should look like non-art. That's what people like Donald Judd and Carl Andre said at the time. We were looking for the look of non-art, the zero. And I totally agreed with it. And you realize that the look of non-art was a real act of defiance on the part of young artists at the time, because art had a look. The look was Jackson Pollock. The look was Giacometti. That's the art look. And when we were in our 20s, and it was a defiant period, the 60s, it was necessary to defy the look of art. And now I feel like I don't think that anymore, but the point is, at that time I did think it. And when I was trying to make photography on this larger scale, it was difficult to find a way to actually do it, that is technically, because there were limitations. And I did come across the transparent medium partly by accident, and I thought, yes, this really is vulgar. This really is, this has the look of non-art. And it had a shocking effect at the beginning, and people have told me that when they first saw some of my pictures, they were sort of startled by the ugliness of them. and the intrusiveness of them. And I don't identify that with my particularly defiant or intrusive personality, because I don't think that's necessary. But obviously I took some pleasure in it at the time, of getting in people's faces about it, because that was in a way the ethos of the time. I think there is a certain quality in that, because even though we can, and I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, maybe to just wrap it up, which was rediscovering these so-called eternal or permanent aesthetic values can really have the risk of lapsing into a kind of stuffy, conventional, tiresome, boring, academic art thing. And that is not what I would want to see for myself as the outcome of finding out that there are these rather permanent values. But these permanent values only make themselves valuable in the new, in what is now. You can see artists always wanting to go back and paint like the 16th century or do an 18th century thing, or all that sort of stuff. And it's usually pretty bad, because it's taking the idea of eternal values in a sort of almost religious way, as if time hasn't passed. So the look of non-art is actually really quite important. And it should always somehow be part of the recovery of these basic values. Photography has one advantage on that level, which is the automatic capture of visual information is involuntary. The machine does it, so it brings in this inartistic treatment of the real, and then we work with that. So I didn't care about the backlighting as a effect, really, although it's interesting. It's a nuisance sometimes, but the real key to it was what I just said. It had this look of, it had a rather defiant anti-art look about it, and I loved the idea of doing really artistic things with a really anti-art element inside it, and I still feel that way.
We are back with your question. We are back also to the idea of construction, because the white box is a construction. It's a tableau is not a construction. I mean, it may be a construction, but basically it is not. A white box is a construction. I mean, and the cultural construction, and the ideological construction, and so on and so on. But construction in the show is something else. It's inside the logic of composition. Jeff needs to build things inside a process of composition. A very good example is the very last picture, Flooded Grave. I mean, it's a landscape, and a strange landscape, and in this landscape there is a construction on the foreground, and this had to be constructed, this piece of the landscape. So I think it's interesting, because what is dominant is the idea of composition, but construction is necessary, and construction is part of this, way of playing with the context, the cultural context, as we just mentioned. I mean, every artist has to find his way, his position, his or her way, and position, and then it's a matter of constructing something. You don't compose a position. You build a position. You construct. It's more a matter of construction. But we really need the two things. You really need the two dimensions. And the work which doesn't have the two dimensions is always a little bit problematic. I think if you are only on the side of construction without composition, it's problematic, as well as the opposite.
Gracias.